probably start at this point. So today we are investigating a really cool lab called The Mystery of the Strait of Gibraltar. And if you're my student, you do have a copy of this lab. If you're not my student, well, welcome, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So the mystery of the Strait of Gibraltar is something that has puzzled people in the ancient times. We've since solved it, but this is a really cool lab for us to investigate how we can use experiments to demonstrate like big real-world things. So the mystery is that the Strait of Gibraltar is a tiny piece of land that separates the Atlantic Ocean, or it's, I guess, a hole in the land that separates the Atlantic Ocean from the Mediterranean Sea. And so we have a relatively fresh water body, and we have a very saline, like a salt water body, and they're meeting each other. And at that point where they meet, there's this intense current that basically goes about 2 meters per second, which is pretty insane. And so ancient people were so curious about this, the Phoenicians tried to investigate it, and as more modern cartographers were going through the area, they assumed there was some kind of drain. So the water was rushing in, and then it was rushing out somewhere. But the Mediterranean Sea is landlocked. So the problem is, where is this current coming from? And so we're going to take a little look at that, and we're going to try to solve the mystery with the materials that we have in our kitchen. So some materials that you should have on hand is salt, right? We are going to use salt to make our Atlantic Ocean. You're going to need just plain water. It doesn't have to be bottled. In fact, this bottle is multi-purpose. It is holding some tap water, and we're going to use this bottle. So you should have a smallish container with a tiny opening. That's the thing that's important. In fact, you should have 2 of them. So here's another bottle that is also empty and has a small opening, water bottle. You should have a raw egg. I'm going to talk about the raw egg in a moment. Don't worry, you won't be eating it or cracking it. You can probably use it after we're done with it. So raw egg. Some food coloring. I've mentioned to a lot of y'all that like yellow probably isn't the best color to use with this. So like blue or green, or if you're feeling spooky, you could use red, but just some food coloring. And then we want just like a couple of random tools. So I'm going to use this chopstick for some hole punching. I'm going to use this marker to like mark stuff. I have a pair of scissors that we'll use to cut some stuff. And I have just some various other tools. So I have this bigger beaker. It's like the only scientific piece of equipment I have in my home right now. And some measuring cups, just so we can kind of record how much salt we are using. So there's a couple other things that we want to have. I forgot to mention, we also, along with that salt, want some pepper. Promise we will not be cooking. This is just going to be used in one of the demos. And then finally, this is my masterpiece. I have taken basically a Tupperware kind of container that has a very flat bottom and kind of a low height. And we're going to use this to demonstrate this actual strait. So what I've put in here is I've taped a piece of tinfoil in here, and I'm actually going to puncture a hole in it to create the strait. But y'all are creative humans, and so you could create any kind of setup like this. Maybe use a cake pan and a sheet of plastic. You could maybe, I don't know, use some clay or something. I was thinking about using clay, but decided to go the tinfoil route. And I think that's just about it. So in our investigation, we want to investigate 3 things. So the first thing we want to look at is what happens when salt water and fresh water meet. Does something magical happen? The second thing we want to investigate is what happens to boats when they are in fresh water, and what happens to boats when they are in salt water. And the third thing we want to investigate today is what happens when a boat sitting on a saltwater body hits a section of fresh water, and just exploring what happens as that is rushing through the strait. So I, on our lab, have divided these investigations into 3. You do not have to do all of them at once like I'm doing here. I'm kind of doing a speed run, so to say. But it might be helpful to do one and two first and then think about 3 and do it later. But like I said, I'm doing a speed run. We're going to run through these really fast. Okay, so our first investigation is we are going to look at what happens when salt and fresh water meet one another. So we're going to take 2 equal amounts of salt water and fresh water, and we're going to take some food coloring, and we are going to use our 2 bottles to basically pour the two samples of into each other. Now, if you look, right, this fresh water that's in here and this empty one that will be salt water will probably look the same. So the food coloring is going to be used to differentiate the 2. I'm going to put the food coloring into the salt water just because I think that's the cooler one to look at. So I've actually made some salt water ahead of time, and this one does look a little yellowish. I did tinge it so I didn't get it confused with some of the fresh water that I had. I also did it in an old spaghetti container. It's probably some of the stuff that came out of it. So we can see here that this is the salt water. You can also just make salt water. And so for this one, I might just make the salt water. So we're going to be kind of unscientific here. I'm going to take salt. I'm going to just pour salt into my open bottle here. You can hear the lovely sound of salt hitting the inside of the bottle as I spill a bit. And you'll see that there's a good amount inside of the bottle right now. I'm going to then fill it with some of the fresh water. And I'm going to just do like kind of a 50-50 mix here. So we'll just split the water between the 2 bottles. It's not the end of the world if they're not the same. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to make solutions later this year. But if I was doing this in a lab, I probably would be applying heat and some stirring, and I don't have either. So I'm just going to shake the bottle pretty vigorously until as much of the salt as possible is dissolved. Now, you want it to be pretty high salinity for this to work. I did have the numbers of what the salinity of the Atlantic Ocean is written down somewhere on one of your assignments. I don't have it right now. Okay, so you'll see this is completely mixed. You could do like a super saturated solution where you basically add salt until it does not dissolve anymore, but that just seems kind of like a little bit of a waste for this one. But I will say the other mixture I made earlier is very saturated. Okay, so we have our 2 bottles, one fresh, one salt. We're going to add a little bit of food coloring to the salt water so we know which one it is. I'm going to go with blue, make it all fancy like. Just a couple drops. No sense in wasting food coloring. Just a little bit goes a long way. And just kind of stir a little bit. See, beautiful, beautiful saltwater body. Now, if I'm curious about what's going to happen when these 2 mix, I probably don't want to just directly pour it in. So what I did is I took the lids of one of these and I kind of made a little star shape in the lid so that I could kind of have it kind of drip into that. Now, I'm going to stick this lid on the salt water. And the fresh water is going to have no lid because I'm going to pour it in there. Now, this is where I have to get kind of tricky with the camera work so y'all can actually see what's happening. And gonna have this here. I'm just trying to think how I can make sure y'all see what's happening. Maybe if I tilt it at an angle. I think actually that'll be perfect. I'll hold it up a little bit. There. Okay. So we have fresh water. Salt water is coming. What happens? Do we observe anything with the food coloring? What you should be seeing is that there is a darker blue layer. It's a little hard to see with the contrast. There's a dark blue layer forming at the bottom of our experiment. The blue is not mixing with the clear, it's just sinking down at the bottom. And I'm going to try to hold it up just a little bit more. If you look really closely, you can actually see there's a lot of swirling action. And if you're doing this in person, you'll definitely be able to see this. But as I continue to carefully pour these two now, I'm just going to go for it. As you'll see, the bottom has just a bunch of the salt water sinking down to it. So that's kind of the first thing we can keep in mind, is when we add salt water to fresh water, the salt water sinks to the bottom, but it also swirls around a little bit before it does that. I'm not going to explain why, because I'm going to have you kind of think a little bit more about that. But that's observation one. So salt water and fresh water don't mix super easily. They form layers. That's learning number one. All right, so now we want to investigate number two. What happens when you put a boat in fresh water, and what happens when you put a boat in salt water? So we're going to start with the fresh water. I am actually going to walk over to I'm going to ask my lovely lab assistant to get me some more water. Thank you, lab assistant. Yeah, you can just use that. Awesome. And let's do like, here, I'll just take it. Thank you. So we have fresh water. We'll do 400 milliliters. Thanks. We have our egg of science, our boat. And I'm just gonna clunk our little raw egg into the water. Okay, what happened? He's not too happy. This is not a good boat. He's definitely not floating too much. That seems problematic. So I'm gonna transfer this water into another container to be used later. And we're gonna do the same thing with my slightly nasty salt water. So, pour salt water. Have a little bit more than 400, but that's okay. And same thing. We're going to take our boat, stick it in the salt water. What do you observe? You probably didn't hear a clunk because the egg did not hit the bottom of it. It is floating. It is the same egg. Why is our egg floating in salt water? Give you a moment to think about that. So, investigation number two. Things float just a little bit, actually a lot better, in a saline solution in salt water. All right, so we've done two investigations. We've looked at what happens when salt water and fresh water combine. The salt water sinks to the bottom. We have also looked at what happens when we stick something in salt water versus when we stick it into fresh water. We have a difference of buoyancy there. So our final investigation is to find out what happens when boats go from the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic, and what happens when boats go from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean Sea. And why is there just so much current between the two? So to do this investigation, we'll clean up a little bit here, move our little egg. Our egg has done his job. He's done great. Good job, egg. And you're gonna take my little cake pan, my little Tupperware tray here that we saw earlier. And like I said, what I did between these two is I basically just taped down a sheet of aluminum foil. I have this chopstick that I'm going to eventually punch a hole into, or use it to punch a hole into this aluminum foil to create the Strait of Gibraltar. I also have a backup pair of scissors in case it doesn't work the way I'm hoping it will. And what I'm going to do before I punch that hole, though, is I'm going to take our lovely salt water that we used with the last experiment and put it on one side. I'm going to put some food coloring in it. And then I'm going to take some fresh water and I'm going to put it on the other side. So the salt water is the Atlantic and the fresh water is the Mediterranean. And scoot just this a little bit more so we can see it just slightly better. Oh, other way. Here we go. And I might just write right on here. We'll say this is the Atlantic upside down. And here's the Mediterranean. I think I actually spelt Mediterranean right. All right, so we said we wanted some food coloring in the Atlantic. Two drops. And no food coloring in the Mediterranean. I mean, you could, I guess, a different color. All right, so we're gonna stick fresh water in here. This will be my test to see how good a taping job I did. Oh. Found a little spot. That's okay. Now, remember how we had some pepper? So we're going to take just a tiny little bit of this pepper. And since the egg is kind of too big to really watch it flow between the Strait I'm about to cut in here, we're going to use pepper to be kind of like our little boat. So we can also just track what happens. So hopefully you can see, it's a whole flotilla of boats. All right, I'm just going to make sure this is taped down really good. All right, so this next